The first thing he saw was water trembling under cold blue light and a small hand slipping beneath the surface. The pool stretched silent behind the glass walls of the Caldwell estate, a perfect mirror broken only by ripples that shouldn't have been there, and for a split second the world felt paused, like the house itself was holding its breath. Amara Brooks didn't think. She moved, her shoes skidding against polished stone as she crossed the distance in less than a heartbeat, the night air sharp against her skin, the faint echo of thunder rolling somewhere far beyond the hills. The boy's name barely left her lips before she was already in the water, her arms cutting through the surface, her dress pulling heavy around her legs, her focus locked on the small shape just beneath her. Noah. She reached him before the silence could deepen, before the moment could become something irreversible, pulling him upward with steady strength, her breath controlled even as her heart slammed against her ribs. His eyes fluttered, his small fingers gripping instinctively at her sleeve, and when she brought him to the edge, lifting him onto the marble, she didn't rush, didn't panic, just stayed anchored, one hand on his back, one hand steady against the ground, whispering his name like it was the only thing that mattered. Inside, the house was still lit like a showroom, warm gold spilling across empty rooms, untouched furniture arranged with precision that felt more like display than comfort. Ethan Caldwell stepped through the front doors at that exact moment, his presence filling the space before his voice ever did, the sharp click of his shoes against the floor echoing with authority, his phone still in his hand, his expression already set in that familiar controlled stillness that defined him in boardrooms and interviews alike. He didn't see the beginning, he saw the aftermath. The glass doors reflected the scene back at him before he fully registered it, a distorted image of Amara kneeling beside his son, her hair damp, her uniform clinging to her frame, Noah pressed close against her, as if the world outside her arms didn't exist. Ethan stopped mid-step, his jaw tightening, his gaze narrowing not with confusion, but with immediate judgment, the kind that didn't wait for explanation, didn't pause for context. What happened? The question wasn't asked to understand, it was delivered like an accusation already formed. Amara looked up slowly, her breathing steady now, her voice calm, measured, but before she could speak, Noah's small hand tightened in her sleeve, his face turning toward her instinctively, not toward his father, not toward the figure standing tall and distant under the chandelier, but toward the one who had just held him together. That single detail passed through Ethan's mind without landing where it should have, replaced instead by the image in front of him that didn't match his expectations, his rules, his order. You were supposed to be watching him. His voice dropped lower, sharper, each word precise, controlled, final. Amara didn't move. She didn't rush to defend herself, didn't raise her voice, didn't point toward the pool behind her where the water had already settled back into stillness as if nothing had happened. She simply placed her hand gently over Noah's, grounding him, her eyes lifting to meet Ethan's with a quiet steadiness that carried no fear, no urgency, only truth waiting to be seen. But he wasn't looking for truth. He was looking for fault. You're fired. The words landed clean, cold, and absolute, cutting through the space with more force than any raised voice ever could. Somewhere in the house, a staff member paused. Another turned, the quiet ripple of awareness spreading through hallways that had seen scenes like this before, power exercised without hesitation, decisions made without reconsideration. Amara held Noah for 1 second longer, just enough to make sure his breathing had steadied, just enough to let him feel the presence he trusted before it was taken away. Then she gently eased his hand from her sleeve, standing with the same composed grace she had always carried. No rush, no visible reaction, only a subtle inhale as she stepped back into her place, not beneath him, but separate from him entirely. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the small ring of keys she had carried every day for the past 2 years, and placed them carefully on the glass table beside the door, the soft sound louder than it should have been in the silence that followed. Ethan didn't stop her. He didn't ask another question. He didn't look at the pool. His attention was already moving forward, already detaching from the moment, as if resolving it had erased it. Behind him, Noah shifted, his small voice breaking through in a way that didn't fit the polished perfection of the house. Amara. It wasn't loud, but it carried a thread of fear and confusion woven into a single word. a call that reached for something steady. Ethan turned slightly, just enough to hear it clearly, and for the first time, something didn't align. His son wasn't looking at him. He was looking at her. Amara paused at the doorway, her hand resting briefly against the frame, not hesitating, not waiting, simply acknowledging the moment before stepping out into the night air that had grown cooler, the distant city lights stretching across the horizon like something far removed from everything inside that house. She didn't look back. She didn't speak. Her silence stayed intact, not as surrender, but as something far stronger, something that didn't need permission to exist. Inside, the space she left behind shifted in a way that couldn't be measured immediately. Noah stood still, his small hands now empty, his eyes fixed on the door long after it had closed, his breathing uneven in a way that had nothing to do with what had just happened outside by the pool. Ethan exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, his posture resetting, his control reassembling itself piece by piece. It was handled. It was done. That's how he saw it. That's how he always saw things. Problems identified. Solutions executed. Movement forward. But something in the air didn't settle the way it usually did. The house felt different, quieter in a way that wasn't calm, but hollow. And somewhere beyond the glass walls, the water in the pool reflected the lights above, perfectly still now, holding a truth that had already been decided before it could ever be spoken. The house did not sound the same after she left, even though nothing visible had changed, the lights still glowing in perfect symmetry, the air still carrying that faint scent of polished wood and quiet wealth. But something beneath it all had shifted, something subtle enough to go unnoticed by anyone who did not live inside the details, and yet heavy enough to press against every corner of the space. Ethan Caldwell stood in the center of the living room for a moment longer than usual, his posture still composed, his expression unreadable, but his attention no longer anchored the way it had been minutes before. He adjusted his cuff slowly, the motion automatic, practiced, the kind of movement that usually brought him back into control, but tonight it felt like a gesture without weight. Behind him, Noah had not moved. The boy remained near the glass doors, his small frame outlined by the reflection of the pool lights outside, his eyes fixed on the empty space where Amara had stood, as if the moment had not fully ended for him. Ethan turned slightly, his gaze falling on his son, and for a brief second, something unfamiliar passed through his mind. Not concern, not yet, but a question that did not belong in his usual line of thinking. Why is he still standing there? It was not spoken, just observed, filed away, but it lingered longer than expected. Noah's voice came again, softer this time, almost uncertain, as if saying the name once had not been enough. Amara. The way he said it was not casual, not routine. It carried something deeper, something that sounded like reliance, and that detail did not sit comfortably within Ethan's understanding of the situation. He stepped closer, his tone measured, controlled, the same voice that closed million-dollar deals without hesitation. It is late. Go upstairs. The instruction was simple, direct, designed to move things forward the way they always did. But Noah did not respond immediately. He looked up, his eyes searching Ethan's face, not with defiance, but with something that felt closer to confusion. Where did she go? The question hung in the air longer than it should have, stretching the silence between them in a way that felt disproportionate to its simplicity. Ethan exhaled quietly, his patience thinning not out of anger, but out of unfamiliarity with the situation. She is no longer working here. His answer was precise, final, the way he delivered all decisions, expecting it to settle the matter. But Noah did not move. His small hands curled slightly at his sides, his gaze drifting back toward the door again, as if the explanation had not reached him at all. She said she would read to me tonight. That detail landed differently. Not loud, not dramatic, but it shifted something in the atmosphere that Ethan could not immediately categorize. He watched his son for a moment longer, noticing the way the boy's posture had tightened, the way his usual ease had been replaced with a stillness that felt unnatural for a child his age. Ethan turned away first, walking toward the hallway with the same steady pace he always carried, choosing not to engage further, choosing control over uncertainty. Upstairs, Noah's room remained untouched, everything in its place, books aligned, toys arranged, a space designed for comfort that suddenly felt incomplete without the presence that had given it warmth. Ethan paused briefly at the doorway, watching as Noah climbed onto the bed without his usual energy, without the small details that had once filled these moments. No quiet excitement, no reaching for the book he always insisted on hearing. Instead, the boy sat still, his eyes lowered, his fingers tracing the edge of the blanket as if waiting for something that was no longer coming. Ethan stepped inside, picking up a book from the nightstand, flipping it open with a practiced motion, his voice steady as he began to read, each word clear, precise, but lacking something he had never needed to consider before. Noah did not react. He did not interrupt, did not ask questions, did not lean in the way he used to. He simply listened in silence, his expression distant, his attention somewhere else entirely. Ethan stopped after a few pages, lowering the book slightly, his eyes narrowing just enough to acknowledge the disconnect. "You should be sleeping." Noah nodded, but he did not lie down right away. Instead, he looked up once more, his voice quiet but certain in a way that did not match his age. "She pulled me out." The words were simple, almost understated, but they did not land the way Ethan expected. "Pulled you out of what?" Noah hesitated, as if the memory itself was still forming into something he could explain, his small brow furrowing slightly. "The water." Ethan's grip on the book tightened almost imperceptibly. He did not respond immediately. His mind moved quickly, replaying the scene he had walked into, the image of Amara kneeling by the pool, Noah in her arms, her uniform damp, her breathing controlled, her silence steady. He had seen it. He had interpreted it. He had decided. And yet now, with those two words, something did not align. He closed the book slowly, placing it back on the nightstand with deliberate care, his thoughts beginning to shift from conclusion to reconsideration. "You slipped." That was the version that made sense, the version that fit into his original judgment. But Noah shook his head slightly, his voice still soft, but firm in a way that felt grounded in something real. "I could not get out." The room seemed to quiet even further, the subtle hum of the air system fading into the background as Ethan processed the statement in silence. He stood there for a moment, his posture unchanged, but his focus sharpening in a way that had nothing to do with business, nothing to do with control, and everything to do with the possibility that he had missed something critical. Downstairs, the reflection of the pool remained still, the surface unbroken, hiding the truth of what had happened beneath its calm appearance. Ethan finally stepped back from the bed, his voice returning to its usual tone, though something beneath it had shifted. "Get some rest." He turned and walked out, closing the door behind him with a quiet click, but his pace slowed as he moved down the hallway, his mind no longer moving forward, but circling back, replaying the fragments of the night that no longer fit together the way they had before. In the security room at the far end of the house, the monitors glowed softly, a grid of silent recordings capturing every angle of the estate, every movement preserved without interpretation. Ethan stood in the doorway for a second, his hand resting lightly against the frame, his eyes fixed on the screens as if they held something he had not yet decided to see. Then he stepped inside, the door closing behind him, the quiet of the room wrapping around him as he reached for the controls, his fingers hovering for just a moment before pressing the button that would take him back to the moment he had already judged, the moment that was no longer as simple as he had believed. The screen flickered once before stabilizing, a silent grid of moments waiting to be understood, and Ethan Caldwell stood in front of it with the same stillness he carried into every negotiation. Except this time, there was no room full of people, no polished table, no controlled variables, just him and a version of the truth that had not yet been filtered through his assumptions. He tapped the panel once, rewinding the footage with a precise motion, his eyes narrowing slightly as the timeline shifted back to earlier that evening, the calm before the disruption, the pool outside untouched, the house quiet, predictable, ordered. The recording moved forward again, second by second, and there she was, Amara, moving through the frame with the same quiet efficiency that had once made her invisible in his world, her posture composed, her attention always slightly ahead of the moment, anticipating needs that were never spoken. She stepped outside with Noah trailing just behind her, the boy's small figure relaxed, comfortable, his presence lighter than it had been upstairs just minutes ago. Ethan leaned closer to the screen, his focus sharpening as the sequence unfolded, noticing details he had never considered before, The way Noah stayed near her without hesitation, the way she glanced back occasionally, not out of obligation, but out of awareness. The pool reflected the evening light, still and clear, and for a moment, everything appeared ordinary, unremarkable, exactly as it should have been. Then the shift came, subtle at first, almost easy to miss if not for the way Amara's body reacted before anything else changed. She turned her head slightly, her attention snapping toward the water just as Noah moved. Closer to the edge, his curiosity pulling him forward in a way children did not measure. Ethan's breath slowed without him realizing it, his hand resting against the edge of the console as the moment unfolded in front of him with a clarity he had not allowed himself before. Noah leaned too far, his balance breaking in a way that happened quickly, silently, the kind of moment that did not announce itself until it had already begun. The surface of the pool shifted, the reflection distorting, and in the next frame, he was gone from the edge. Ethan's jaw tightened. He did not move, did not speak, did not interrupt the footage, his eyes fixed on the screen as Amara reacted without hesitation, without pause, her body already in motion before the reality of the situation had fully formed. She did not look around for help, did not call out, did not freeze. She moved, one step, then another, and then she was in the water, her form cutting through the surface with purpose, her focus locked entirely on the small figure beneath. Ethan felt something shift in his chest, not sudden, not dramatic, but undeniable. The footage did not rush, it did not dramatize, it simply showed the truth in real time. The seconds that followed measured not in panic, but in precision. Amara reached Noah, her movements controlled, her grip firm, lifting him upward with a strength that came from something deeper than obligation. She guided him to the edge, her own breath steady even as the situation demanded urgency, her attention fixed entirely on making sure he was safe, present, breathing. She did not check the cameras, did not look toward the house, did not seek acknowledgement. She stayed anchored to him, one hand steady against his back, her voice too soft to be captured clearly, but her lips moving in a rhythm that suggested reassurance, grounding, calm. Ethan's hand tightened slightly against the console. He replayed that part again, slower this time, his eyes tracking every movement, every detail he had overlooked. There was no confusion. There was no ambiguity. There was only action, direct and undeniable. She had seen what he had not. She had moved before anyone else could have. She had done exactly what needed to be done, and she had done it alone. The footage continued, showing her lifting Noah fully out of the water, guiding him to sit, staying close, her presence steady even as the moment began to settle. And then, the frame shifted again, showing the exact moment Ethan himself entered the scene, his figure appearing at the edge of the screen, composed, unaware, stepping into a reality he had already misread. He watched himself now, from the outside, the way he had stood there, the way his expression had hardened immediately, the way his voice had carried authority without question, without pause, without understanding. He saw the way Amara had looked up at him, calm, steady, not defensive, not desperate, just present, waiting for something he had not given her. He saw Noah reaching for her, not for him. He saw the moment he had spoken the words, clear even without sound, the shape of them unmistakable. "You are fired." Ethan exhaled slowly, stepping back from the screen as the footage looped to the end, the room falling silent again except for the low hum of the monitors. The clarity of it did not leave room for interpretation. It did not soften the edges of what had happened. It did not offer him a version where he had been right. It simply showed him the truth, exactly as it had unfolded, without bias, without distortion. He stood there for a long moment, his posture unchanged, but the weight of the realization settling in a way that did not fit into his usual framework of control. He had made a decision based on assumption. He had acted without verification. He had dismissed the one person who had protected what mattered most to him, and he had done it publicly, definitively, without giving her the chance to speak. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier, not because of what had happened, but because of what he had done in response to it. Ethan reached forward again, pausing the screen on the frame where Amara held Noah at the edge of the pool, her expression focused, composed, her presence steady in a moment that could have gone differently if she had not been there. He stared at that image longer than he intended, his mind moving through the implications, not just of the event itself, but of the pattern it revealed, the way he had overlooked her, underestimated her, reduced her to a role that had never captured the reality of who she was in that house. Upstairs, Noah shifted in his sleep, the faint sound barely reaching the security room, but enough to remind Ethan that the consequences of this moment were not contained to the past. They extended forward, into every interaction, every absence, every unanswered question. Ethan straightened slightly, his jaw tightening again, but this time not out of control, but out of something closer to recognition. He turned off the monitor, the screen going dark, the reflection of his own face staring back at him for a brief second before disappearing entirely. The house was quiet again, but it was not the same silence as before. It was filled with something unresolved, something that demanded more than a simple adjustment, more than a quiet correction. Ethan stepped out of the security room, closing the door behind him, his footsteps slower now, more deliberate, his mind no longer moving ahead, but circling back to a single point that had shifted everything. He had been wrong, and for the first time in a long time, that realization did not feel like a problem he could solve from a distance. It felt like something he would have to face directly. The hallway felt longer than it had ever been, each step carrying a weight that did not belong to the marble floors or the quiet architecture of the house, but to the realization that followed Ethan Caldwell like a shadow he could no longer ignore. And as he moved toward the staircase, the silence around him was no longer controlled, it was listening. Upstairs, a soft glow leaked from beneath Noah's door, not bright, not urgent, just enough to suggest that sleep had not fully taken hold, and Ethan paused outside for a moment, his hand hovering near the handle. The same hesitation he never allowed himself in boardrooms now anchoring him in a place he did not fully understand. He opened the door quietly, the hinges barely making a sound, and stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light that softened the edges of the room. Noah was awake, sitting upright against the headboard, his small frame wrapped in the blanket, his gaze drifting toward the window where the faint outline of the pool could still be seen through the glass. Ethan closed the door behind him, slower this time, more aware of the space he was entering, more aware of the presence he had disrupted earlier. "You should be sleeping," he said again, but the words did not carry the same authority they had before. They landed softer, almost uncertain, as if he was testing how they would be received. Noah did not lie down. He turned his head slightly, his eyes finding Ethan's, not searching, not questioning, just steady in a way that felt older than his years. "She always stays until I fall asleep." The statement was simple, factual, but it held something deeper, something that spoke to a routine that had existed without Ethan fully noticing, a rhythm that had shaped his son's sense of comfort without ever being acknowledged. Ethan stepped further into the room, his posture still straight, but his movements less precise, less automatic. He glanced at the chair in the corner, the one Amara used to sit in, the faint indentation in the cushions still visible, the quiet evidence of her presence lingering in a way that did not disappear just because she was gone. He moved toward it without fully deciding to, lowering himself into the seat with a stiffness that did not belong to the furniture, but to the unfamiliarity of the action. The room felt different from this angle, smaller, more intimate, less like a space to be managed and more like one to be understood. Noah watched him for a moment, then looked down at his hands, his fingers tracing the edge of the blanket again, the same small motion Ethan had noticed earlier, the same quiet sign of something unsettled. Ethan cleared his throat slightly, his voice steadying as he reached for something that felt increasingly out of reach. "I can stay." The words were not rehearsed, not calculated, they came out slower than usual, as if he was measuring them even as he spoke. Noah did not respond right away. He shifted slightly, adjusting the blanket around his shoulders, his gaze returning to the window for a brief second before settling back on Ethan. "She tells the story different." Ethan nodded once, though he did not know what the difference was, only that it mattered more than he had realized. "What story?" Noah hesitated, as if deciding how to explain something that had always just existed for him, something that had never needed to be translated before. "The one about the little boy who thinks he is alone, but is not." The words landed quietly, but they carried a weight that pressed against Ethan's understanding in a way that did not align with the simplicity of the story itself. He leaned back slightly in the chair, his eyes moving to the bookshelf, scanning the titles without seeing them, his mind working through something that was no longer about control or resolution, but about recognition. "Tell it to me." The request was not an order, not a directive. It was something else, something that did not come naturally to him, something that required him to listen rather than define. Noah looked at him again, his expression softening just slightly, as if the invitation had shifted something, even if only a little. He began slowly, his voice quiet, uneven at first, then steadier as the words found their rhythm. "There is a boy, and he lives in a big house, but it is too quiet, and he thinks nobody hears him. But there is someone who always listens, even when he does not see her." Ethan remained still, his attention locked not on the details of the story, but on the way it was being told, the way Noah's voice carried a familiarity with the narrative that suggested it had been repeated many times, shaped, refined, held close. The story continued, simple in structure, but layered in meaning, describing a presence that stayed even when unseen, a voice that comforted without needing to be noticed, a quiet strength that made the boy feel safe without ever demanding recognition. Ethan's gaze drifted again to the chair he was sitting in, to the space Amara had occupied night after night, listening, speaking, existing in a way that had never required acknowledgement to have impact. When Noah finished, the room fell silent again, but this time it was not empty. It was filled with something that had been there all along, something Ethan had simply never taken the time to see. He exhaled slowly, his posture easing just slightly, the rigid edges of his control softening in a way that felt unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. "You are not alone." The words came out steady, but quieter than anything he had said that day, carrying a weight that extended beyond the moment, beyond the room, beyond the boundaries he had once defined so clearly. Noah nodded, his eyes finally closing as he settled back against the pillow, the tension in his small frame easing in a way that had not happened earlier, as if the space had shifted just enough to allow it. Ethan remained in the chair, not moving, not leaving, the seconds passing without urgency, without the need to transition to the next task, the next decision, the next outcome. For the first time, he stayed without purpose. And in that stillness, the absence in the room did not feel like something to be ignored. It felt like something that needed to be restored. Morning arrived without announcement, the lights slipping through the tall windows in long, quiet streaks that stretched across the polished floors, touching everything except the places that mattered. And Ethan Caldwell stood in the kitchen with a cup of coffee he had not taken a sip from, his reflection faint in the glass as he stared out toward the pool that now looked exactly as it always had, still, controlled, untouched, as if the night before had never happened. The house moved around him with its usual precision, staff arriving, footsteps measured, voices low, everything operating on a rhythm that had been perfected over time. But he noticed something now that he had never allowed himself to see before, the subtle glances, the hesitation in movement, the quiet awareness that lingered in the air like something unspoken. He set the cup down without drinking, his fingers resting briefly against the counter before he turned toward the hallway, his pace steady but no longer automatic. In the living room, two members of the staff stood near the far wall, their voices barely above a whisper, stopping the moment they realized he was there, their posture shifting into something more formal, more guarded. Ethan paused just long enough to acknowledge them, his gaze steady, but not dismissive in the way it once had been. "Who was on shift last night?" The question was simple, but it landed differently now, carrying something beneath it that made both of them straighten slightly, exchanging a quick glance before one of them stepped forward. "I was, sir." Her voice was controlled, respectful, but there was a tension there, something that suggested awareness beyond the question itself. Ethan nodded once, his eyes not leaving hers. "Did you see what happened by the pool?" The room seemed to quiet even further, the air tightening in a way that made the moment stretch just slightly longer than it should have. "Yes, sir." The answer came without hesitation, but not without weight. Ethan held her gaze for a second longer, his voice lowering just enough to strip away the distance he usually maintained. "Then tell me what you saw." She hesitated, not because she did not know, but because saying it out loud meant stepping into something that had already been decided without her voice, something that could not be undone by words alone. She swallowed lightly, her posture still respectful, but her tone shifting just enough to carry truth instead of caution. He slipped, "Sir." He got too close to the edge. "And Miss Brooks." She moved before anyone else could. Ethan did not react outwardly, but something in his expression tightened, not with resistance, but with confirmation, the alignment of what he had seen with what he had chosen to ignore. She did not hesitate. The woman continued, her voice steady now, as if once the words began, they needed to reach their end. She did exactly what she was supposed to do. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him in a way that felt heavier than it should have, his mind no longer searching for clarity, because clarity had already been given. He nodded once, a small acknowledgement, before turning away, his attention shifting toward the staircase as if the conversation had reached its limit, even though its impact had only just begun. Upstairs, Noah was already awake. Sitting at the small table near the window, a bowl of cereal untouched in front of him, the spoon resting against the side as if he had forgotten what it was for. He looked up as Ethan entered, his expression not resistant, not upset, just distant in a way that did not belong to a child. Ethan stepped inside, closing the door behind him, his gaze moving briefly to the book on the nightstand, the one he had not finished reading, the one that did not sound the same when he tried. "Did you sleep?" The question felt smaller than usual, less like a check and more like an attempt to connect something that had been interrupted. Noah nodded slightly, but his eyes did not brighten, did not shift in the way they once had when mornings began with familiarity. Ethan moved closer, glancing at the bowl. "You should eat." Noah looked down at it, then back up again, his voice quiet, but clear. "She always makes it warm." The statement landed softly, but it carried something that reached deeper than instruction, deeper than routine. Ethan pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, his movements slower, more deliberate, as if he was stepping into something he did not yet know how to navigate. "I can warm it." Noah watched him for a moment, then shook his head slightly, not in defiance, but in recognition of something missing that could not be replaced by action alone. "It is not the same." The room settled into silence again, but this time it was not empty. It was filled with absence, defined by what was no longer there. Ethan leaned back slightly, his hands resting on the table, his gaze steady on his son, and for the first time, the solution did not present itself immediately, did not form into something he could execute and resolve. Instead, it remained open, unresolved, requiring something more than decision. He stood after a moment, his chair sliding back quietly, his posture straightening as if instinct was trying to return him to what he knew. "Finish what you can." The words felt insufficient even as he said them, but they were all he had in that moment. As he stepped out of the room, closing the door behind him, the weight of what had changed followed him into the hallway, into the spaces that once felt controlled, predictable, manageable. By the time he reached his office, the city stretching out beyond the glass in sharp lines and distant movement, he had already made more decisions in his mind than most people would in a week, but none of them addressed the one thing that now mattered. He moved to his desk, his fingers resting against the surface before he reached for his phone, the motion precise, but not rushed. He paused for a brief second, the name already in his mind, the absence already defined, the truth already undeniable. Then he dialed. The call connected quickly, his assistant's voice calm and efficient on the other end. "Good morning, sir." Ethan did not sit. He remained standing, his gaze fixed on the skyline, his tone steady, but different in a way that could not be easily defined. "I need you to find someone for me." There was no hesitation on the other end, no question of whether it would be done, only readiness. "Of course, sir." "Name." Ethan exhaled once, his grip tightening slightly around the phone as he spoke the name that now carried more weight than it ever had before. "Amara Brooks." The silence that followed was brief, but noticeable, as if even the space between words understood the shift that had taken place. "I will begin immediately," his assistant replied, her voice still professional, but slightly more attentive, as if she recognized the importance without needing it explained. Ethan ended the call without another word, setting the phone down slowly, his reflection faint in the glass once more, but this time he did not look away. Outside, The city moved as it always did, fast, relentless, indifferent. But inside the house, inside the quiet spaces where presence had once lived unnoticed, something had already begun to change, and this time, it was not something he could control from a distance. The day moved forward, but not in the way it usually did, not with the clean transitions and decisive outcomes that had always defined Ethan Caldwell's world. Instead, it unfolded in fragments, in pauses that lingered longer than they should, in moments where his attention drifted backward instead of forward, returning again and again to a single image he could not dismiss, a frame frozen in his mind where Amara held his son at the edge of the pool with a steadiness that now felt impossible to ignore. His office, once a place of precision and clarity, now felt like a space where something remained unfinished, the skyline outside stretching endlessly, sharp lines cutting across the horizon, yet offering no sense of direction. He stood by the glass, his hands in his pockets, his posture unchanged, but his focus fractured in a way that did not belong to him. The phone on his desk remained silent for several minutes before it finally rang, the sound cutting cleanly through the quiet, pulling his attention back to the present. He turned, crossing the room with measured steps, picking it up before the second ring could complete. Yes, his assistant's voice came through, calm but slightly more alert than usual, as if she understood that this call carried something beyond routine. "I have initial information, sir." Ethan did not sit. He remained standing, his gaze shifting briefly toward the city before settling on nothing in particular. "Go ahead." There was a brief pause, the sound of keys being adjusted, papers being referenced. Then her voice returned, steady, precise. "Amara Brooks left the property on foot last night. She did not request transportation, and she did not contact anyone from the staff afterward." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, the details settling in a way that carried more weight than it should have. "Continue." "She has been employed with the household for 2 years and 4 months. Prior to that, she worked part-time at a community care center on the west side. Records indicate she has no immediate family listed locally." Ethan's fingers curled slightly against the edge of the desk, not in tension, but in focus, the pieces forming a picture he had never taken the time to assemble before. "Current location." There was another pause, longer this time, the kind that suggested the answer was not immediate. "We are still tracing that, sir. There is no recent digital activity tied to her name, no active phone signal registered under her file. It is possible she is using alternate means of communication or none at all." Ethan exhaled slowly, the information settling without resolution, leaving space where certainty should have been. "Find her." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that shifted the tone of the entire conversation. His assistant did not hesitate. "Yes, sir." The call ended, and the silence returned, but it was no longer neutral. It pressed in, filled with the absence of something that had once been constant, something that had shaped the rhythm of the house without ever being acknowledged as essential. Ethan moved back toward the window, his reflection faint against the glass, his expression composed, but his thoughts no longer aligned with the structure he had built his life around. Downstairs, the house continued to function, but not seamlessly. The timing was off, small details misaligned, a glass placed slightly out of position, a chair left at an angle that would have once been corrected immediately. These were not failures, not disruptions that would draw attention under normal circumstances, but now they stood out, not because they mattered, but because they revealed something that had been quietly maintained without recognition. In the kitchen, a staff member adjusted the temperature of a dish twice before stepping back, her expression uncertain, as if she was measuring against a standard that was no longer present to confirm it. Upstairs, Noah sat by the window again, his knees drawn slightly toward his chest, his gaze fixed on the driveway, as if expecting something to return, something that had left without explanation. He had finished none of his breakfast, the bowl now pushed to the side, the milk forming a thin layer on the surface, untouched. Ethan paused at the doorway, watching him for a moment, taking in the stillness that had replaced the energy that once filled the room. He stepped inside quietly, the floor barely creaking beneath his weight, but Noah did not turn immediately. He seemed aware of the presence, but not responsive to it in the way he used to be. "You should be getting ready for school." The words felt routine, but they did not carry the same effect. Noah nodded slightly, but did not move. "She walks me to the car." The statement was not a complaint, not a protest. It was simply a fact, another thread in the routine that had been removed, leaving something incomplete behind. Ethan moved closer, stopping just a few feet away, his hands resting at his sides, his posture less rigid than it had been the day before. "I will take you." Noah turned then, his eyes meeting Ethan's, searching not for permission, but for something else, something that was not fully there. "You do not wait." Ethan did not respond immediately. The observation was accurate, direct, and it landed without defense, without denial. Instead, it created a space, one that required acknowledgement rather than correction. "I will today." The promise came out steady, but it carried a weight that extended beyond the moment, beyond the simple act it described. Noah studied him for a second longer, then nodded once, a small movement that did not fully restore the ease between them, but shifted something slightly, just enough to allow the moment to move forward. As they walked down the hallway together, the distance between them felt different, not closed, not resolved, but recognized. Ethan adjusted his pace without thinking, slowing just enough to match the smaller steps beside him, a detail so minor it would have once gone unnoticed, but now felt deliberate, intentional. At the front door, he paused, reaching for the handle, then stopping for a brief second, his hand resting against the wood as if something held him there. He glanced back toward the house, toward the spaces that now felt altered, toward the absence that had become impossible to ignore. Then he opened the door, stepping out into the morning air, the sunlight sharp, the driveway stretching out in front of them, empty in a way that felt louder than it should. Noah stepped forward first, his small figure moving toward the car, then stopping halfway, his gaze shifting briefly toward the street, as if checking for something that was no longer there. Ethan watched him, the realization settling deeper with each passing second, not just of what had happened, but of what had been lost in the moment he had chosen not to see. And for the first time, the distance he had created did not feel like control. It felt like something he would have to cross himself. The drive to the school was quiet in a way that did not match the morning traffic, the low hum of the engine filling the space between them as Ethan Caldwell kept his eyes forward, his hands steady on the wheel, his posture unchanged, yet his awareness sharper than it had been in years. The road stretched ahead in familiar lines, every turn memorized, every stop predictable, but today the rhythm felt different, slower, as if each second carried more weight than it should. Beside him, Noah sat with his hands folded in his lap, his gaze drifting toward the window, watching the city pass by in reflections that did not seem to hold his attention for long. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but it was not settled either. It lingered, filled with things that had not been said, things that had never needed to be said before. Ethan glanced at him briefly, just once, noticing the way Noah's shoulders remained slightly drawn in, the way his usual ease had not returned, and for the first time, Ethan did not look away immediately. He let the observation stay, let it register fully instead of dismissing it as something temporary. When they pulled into the school driveway, the line of cars moved steadily forward, parents stepping out, doors opening and closing, voices calling out reminders, laughter, routine unfolding in small, familiar pieces. Ethan brought the car to a stop, shifting it into park with a controlled motion, but he did not reach for the door handle right away. Noah unbuckled his seatbelt slowly, his movements careful, deliberate, as if something in him was still waiting for confirmation of what came next. Ethan turned slightly toward him, his voice quieter than usual, not because he intended it to be, but because the moment demanded it. "I will be here when school ends." The promise settled between them, simple, clear, but it carried a weight that extended beyond the words themselves. Noah looked at him, really looked this time, his eyes searching for something deeper than instruction, something that matched the certainty he had just heard. "You will stay?" The question was not challenging, not doubtful. It was cautious, shaped by a pattern that had not always included presence. Ethan held his gaze, not deflecting, not moving past it, and for a brief second, the answer required something more than confidence. Yes. The word came steady, grounded, not reinforced by authority, but by intention. Noah nodded once, a small shift in his posture following, as if the space between them had adjusted just enough to allow movement. He opened the door, stepping out into the morning light, then paused just beside the car, his hand resting lightly against the frame, his gaze lifting back toward Ethan one more time. She used to wave. The statement came softly, not as a comparison, not as a correction, just as a memory placed gently into the moment. Ethan's hand tightened slightly on the steering wheel, the detail settling in with more force than it should have, not because it was significant on its own, but because it represented everything he had not seen. He nodded once, lifting his hand in a small, deliberate motion, the gesture unfamiliar, but intentional. Noah watched for a second, then gave a small wave in return before turning and walking toward the school entrance, his step steady, but slower than the children around him. Ethan remained in the car longer than necessary, his gaze following the small figure until it disappeared through the doors, the routine complete, the moment closed, but not resolved. He exhaled slowly, shifting the car back into drive, pulling away from the curb with the same control he always carried, but the direction felt different now, less about where he was going, and more about what he had left behind. The city moved around him as it always did, traffic merging, signals changing, the flow uninterrupted, but his mind did not align with it. It circled back again, not to the boardroom, not to the contracts waiting on his desk, but to a single name that had begun to reshape everything around it. By the time he reached his office building, the glass tower reflecting the sky in perfect symmetry, his phone had already vibrated twice with updates, messages he would normally prioritize without hesitation. He stepped out of the car, handing the keys to the valet without breaking stride, his pace measured as he entered the lobby, the polished floors reflecting his movement in clean lines. Inside the elevator, the quiet hum surrounded him, the numbers lighting up one by one as he ascended, but his focus remained elsewhere, anchored to something unresolved. When the doors opened to his floor, his assistant was already waiting, her posture composed, her expression attentive in a way that suggested urgency beneath professionalism. "Sir." Ethan nodded once, stepping past her into his office, the door closing behind them with a soft click that sealed the space from everything outside. "Do you have something?" He did not sit. He remained standing, his attention fixed, his tone direct. She stepped forward slightly, holding a tablet, her voice steady but more deliberate than usual. "We found a lead." Ethan's expression did not change, but his focus sharpened instantly. "Go on." She glanced at the screen briefly, then back at him. "There was a payment made early this morning at a small clinic on the west side. It matches her previous employment location. The name used was not hers, but the description fits." Ethan moved closer, his hand reaching for the tablet, his eyes scanning the information quickly, absorbing the details without missing anything. "Address." She turned the screen slightly, indicating the location, her finger resting just beside it. "Here." Ethan stared at it for a moment, the distance calculated automatically, the route already forming in his mind. But this was not a meeting, not a negotiation, not something that fit into his usual structure. This required something else. He handed the tablet back, his decision already made before the thought fully formed. "Cancel my afternoon." His assistant nodded immediately, not questioning, not delaying. "Yes, sir." Ethan turned toward the window, the city stretching out in front of him, but his focus no longer belonged to it. For the first time in years, he was not moving toward control, toward advantage, toward outcome. He was moving toward someone he had dismissed, someone he had overlooked, someone he had already wronged. And as he reached for his jacket, the weight of that realization did not slow him down. It pushed him forward. The engine settled into a low, steady rhythm as Ethan Caldwell guided the car through streets that no longer mirrored the clean symmetry of the world he was used to, the skyline behind him fading into a distant structure of glass and steel while the roads ahead narrowed, bending into neighborhoods that carried a different kind of weight, one built from lived days rather than controlled outcomes. The clinic address remained fixed in his mind, each turn bringing him closer not just to a location, but to a reality he had never stepped into before, one that existed beyond the quiet perfection of his estate. The buildings grew older, closer together, the sidewalks more worn, signs hanging slightly uneven above storefronts that did not compete for attention but simply existed with quiet purpose. He slowed as he approached the intersection his assistant had marked, his eyes scanning the street with a precision that now felt less about observation and more about recognition. The clinic stood at the corner, modest, its sign simple, its windows clear but not polished to reflection, the kind of place that did not announce itself but remained present for those who needed it. Ethan parked along the curb, turning off the engine, but he did not step out immediately. His hands rested on the steering wheel for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on the entrance, the glass door opening and closing as people moved in and out, each one carrying something unseen, something unspoken. This was not his world. There were no assistants waiting, no controlled environment, no guarantees of outcome. Just a door and whatever waited behind it. He stepped out finally, the sound of the car door closing sharper than it should have been, the air carrying a different kind of stillness, one that did not bend around him the way it usually did. As he approached the entrance, the subtle shift in atmosphere became clearer, the quiet conversations, the soft hum of activity, the kind of space where presence mattered more than position. Inside, the reception area was small but orderly, chairs arranged in a way that suggested care rather than design. A few people seated, their attention turned inward rather than outward. The receptionist looked up as he entered, her expression neutral, unguarded, not recognizing him as anything other than another person stepping into the space. Ethan paused for a brief second, the unfamiliarity of that alone settling in, before he moved forward, his voice steady, but lower than it would have been anywhere else. "I am looking for someone." She nodded, reaching for a pen, her tone professional but warm. "Name?" Ethan held her gaze for a moment, then spoke clearly. "Amara Brooks." The name felt different here, not just a reference, but something that carried weight beyond his understanding. The receptionist's expression shifted slightly, not dramatically, but enough to register recognition. She glanced down at the list in front of her, then back up again, her voice measured. "She was here earlier." Ethan's focus sharpened immediately, his posture straightening just slightly. "Is she still here?" The receptionist shook her head gently. "No. She left about 20 minutes ago." The answer landed quietly, but it carried a finality that Ethan had not prepared for. He glanced toward the hallway beyond the desk, the narrow corridor leading deeper into the clinic, the possibility of catching up slipping further away with each second. Did she say where she was going? The question came out controlled, but there was something beneath it now, something closer to urgency than command. The receptionist hesitated, not out of resistance, but out of uncertainty. "No, she did not." She paused briefly, then added, "She does not usually stay long." Ethan absorbed that without responding, his mind already moving, recalculating, adjusting to the fact that he was not in control of the timing, the sequence, the outcome. He nodded once, a small acknowledgement, before stepping back, his gaze drifting once more toward the hallway, as if expecting something to shift, something to correct itself. But nothing did. The moment held exactly as it was, unresolved. As he turned toward the door, a voice came from behind him, soft but clear. "Excuse me." Ethan stopped, turning slightly, his attention shifting toward the source. A nurse stood a few steps away, her posture relaxed but attentive, her expression thoughtful as she approached. "You said you were looking for Amara." Ethan nodded once, his focus returning fully. "Yes." The nurse studied him for a brief second, as if measuring something that was not immediately visible, then spoke carefully. "She comes here for someone else." Ethan's brow lowered slightly, not in confusion, but in concentration. "What do you mean?" The nurse's voice softened just enough to carry context without overstepping. "There is a patient she checks on." She paused, then added, "She does not talk about it much, but she has been coming here regularly for over a year." The information settled in layers, each one revealing something Ethan had never known, something that extended beyond her role in his house, beyond the space he had defined for her. Who is the patient? The question came out steady, but it carried something deeper now, something that acknowledged there was more to understand. The nurse hesitated again, not unwilling, but careful. "I cannot share details like that. But she comes back most afternoons." Ethan stood still, the words anchoring him in place. Not because they answered his question, but because they created a new one, a new direction, a new understanding of the person he had dismissed so quickly. He nodded slowly, the motion deliberate, acknowledging both the limit and the possibility. "Thank you." The nurse offered a small, understanding nod in return, then stepped back, allowing the space to settle once more. Ethan turned toward the door again, stepping outside into the afternoon light, the street unchanged, the movement around him continuing without pause, without awareness of the shift that had just taken place within him. He glanced down the sidewalk briefly, as if expecting to see her there, but the path remained open, empty, leading in both directions without indication. For a moment, he simply stood there, the realization settling deeper, not just that he had missed her, but that he had never truly known her. Then he moved, stepping back toward his car, his pace steady, but his direction no longer defined by certainty. This was no longer about finding someone quickly. It was about understanding who she was, and why she had never needed him to see it. The car door closed with a softer sound this time, as if even the simple act had lost its sharp edges, and Ethan Caldwell stood on the sidewalk for a moment longer than necessary, the clinic behind him, the street stretching ahead in both directions without offering him anything certain to follow. The afternoon light settled over the buildings in a way that revealed more than it hid, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across time rather than distance. And for the first time in years, he did not move immediately toward a next step. Instead, he remained still, his gaze drifting along the sidewalk, noticing details he would have once filtered out: a woman adjusting a child's jacket near the corner, an older man sitting quietly on a bench, the faint sound of a bus pulling away from a stop just down the block. Life moved here without his influence, without his control, and that realization did not unsettle him the way it might have before. It anchored him. He exhaled slowly, turning back toward his car, his hand resting briefly against the roof before he stepped inside, the interior still carrying the familiar scent of leather and precision, a space designed to reflect order. But now it felt smaller, not because it had changed, but because his understanding had expanded beyond it. He started the engine, but instead of pulling away immediately, he reached for his phone, his fingers hovering for a brief second before dialing. The line connected quickly, his assistant's voice clear and ready. "Yes, sir." Ethan leaned back slightly, his gaze fixed ahead, but not focused on the road yet. "I need everything you can find on that clinic. Staff, patient volume, affiliated programs, everything." There was no hesitation on the other end. "I will compile it immediately." Ethan paused for a second, then added, "And I want a list of all registered patients who receive consistent visits from non-family members." The request hung in the air for a moment longer, not because it was unclear, but because it suggested a direction that was no longer purely professional. "Understood, sir." The call ended, and Ethan set the phone down, his hand resting on the steering wheel as his mind began to move differently, not calculating outcomes, but reconstructing a narrative he had never taken the time to see. "She comes here for someone else." The nurse's words echoed quietly, not intrusive, but persistent, threading through his thoughts with a weight that demanded attention. He shifted the car into drive, pulling away from the curb, but his route was no longer defined by routine. Instead of heading back toward the office, he slowed at the next intersection, his eyes scanning the area once more, as if the environment itself might reveal something he had missed. A small convenience store stood across the street, its windows lined with simple displays, the kind of place that served the neighborhood without needing to impress it. He parked again, stepping out, crossing the street with a pace that felt deliberate, purposeful in a way that was no longer tied to efficiency. Inside, the bell above the door chimed softly, drawing the attention of the clerk behind the counter, a man who looked up with mild curiosity before returning to his task. Ethan moved through the aisle slowly, not searching for anything specific, but observing, taking in the small details that made up the space, the arrangement of items, the familiarity in the way customers greeted the clerk, the quiet rhythm of a place that functioned on connection rather than transaction. He approached the counter after a moment, his posture still composed, but his tone different, less authoritative, more direct in a way that invited response rather than demanded it. "Do you know a woman named Amara Brooks?" The clerk looked up again, his expression shifting slightly as he considered the name, then nodding once. "Yeah, she comes in sometimes." Ethan's focus sharpened immediately, but he did not rush the moment. "When was the last time you saw her?" The clerk leaned slightly against the counter, thinking for a second before answering. "This morning, I think. Early. She grabbed a bottle of water and left pretty quick." Ethan absorbed that, the timeline aligning with what he had already been told, but adding another layer, another piece of movement that traced her path. Did she say anything? The clerk shook his head lightly. Not really. She does not talk much, but she always asks how my sister is doing. Ethan's brow lowered slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition of a pattern that continued to unfold. Your sister? Yeah, she has been sick for a while. Amara helped us find that clinic down the street. Ethan stood still, the words settling deeper than the ones before, connecting threads that had remained separate until now. She helped you. The clerk nodded, his tone casual, but sincere. Yeah, she does that. Helps people. Ethan did not respond immediately. He simply nodded once, a small acknowledgement, before stepping back from the counter, the space around him shifting again, not physically, but in meaning. As he walked back out onto the street, the light had changed slightly, the afternoon moving forward, but his understanding had expanded in a way that made time feel less linear, more layered, each moment revealing something that had always been there, just unseen. He reached his car again, but did not get in right away. Instead, he stood there, his gaze moving down the street one more time, not expecting to find her, but recognizing that the search itself had changed. This was no longer about correcting a mistake with a single action. It was about understanding the full weight of that mistake, the full scope of what he had dismissed, and what it would take to face it honestly. He opened the car door slowly, sliding back into the driver's seat, but this time, when he started the engine, he did not look toward the skyline, did not orient himself toward the center of his power. Instead, he looked back toward the clinic, toward the place she would return to, toward the space where her presence mattered in ways he had never measured. And without hesitation, he turned the car around, choosing to wait rather than move on, choosing to stay in a place where time would not bend to him, but where truth might finally meet him halfway. The car remained parked across from the clinic as the afternoon stretched slowly toward evening, the sunlight shifting in quiet gradients across the windshield, turning sharp reflections into softer hues that blurred the edges of everything beyond the glass. And Ethan Caldwell sat behind the wheel without moving, his hands resting loosely, his posture no longer rigid, but not relaxed either, suspended somewhere between intention and uncertainty. Time passed differently here, not marked by meetings or deadlines, but by small movements, the opening of the clinic door, the footsteps of people entering and leaving, the rhythm of a place that did not revolve around him. He checked his watch once, then lowered his wrist, the gesture automatic, but meaningless now, because for the first time, he was not measuring time by productivity, but by presence. Across the street, the clinic door opened again, a young mother stepping out with a child at her side. Their quiet conversation carried briefly by the air before fading into the background of the street, and Ethan watched them pass without fully seeing them, his focus anchored to the doorway, waiting for a figure that had not yet appeared. The city moved around him, cars passing, voices rising and falling, distant sounds blending into a low, steady hum. But inside the car, everything felt still, contained, focused on a single point that had not yet materialized. He leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly, his eyes closing for a brief moment, not in rest, but in thought. The image of the security footage returning again, the clarity of it, the undeniable truth of what had happened, and more importantly, what he had done in response. When he opened his eyes again, the light had shifted further, casting longer shadows across the sidewalk, and the clinic door opened once more. This time he saw her. Amara stepped out slowly, her posture composed, her movements steady, her presence quiet but unmistakable, as if the space itself adjusted around her without effort. She carried a small bag over her shoulder, her expression calm, not hurried, not distracted, just present in the moment as she stepped onto the sidewalk and paused briefly, her gaze lifting toward the street as if orienting herself before moving forward. Ethan did not move immediately. For a fraction of a second, he simply watched, the distance between them holding something that could not be crossed by speed alone. Then he opened the car door, stepping out into the fading light, his shoes meeting the pavement with a sound that felt louder than it should have been. Amara noticed him almost instantly. Her gaze shifted toward him, not startled, not alarmed, just aware, her expression remaining unchanged as she took in his presence, the recognition settling without reaction. Ethan closed the distance slowly, not rushing, not imposing, his steps measured in a way that felt deliberate rather than controlled. When he stopped a few feet in front of her, the space between them held a quiet tension, not hostile, not defensive, but weighted with everything that had not been said. Amara did not step back. She did not look away. She simply stood there, her eyes meeting his with a steadiness that did not demand explanation, did not invite it either. Ethan exhaled once, his gaze steady, but no longer distant, no longer detached. I saw the footage. The words came out clearly, without hesitation, but without the sharp edge they might have carried before. Amara did not respond immediately. She studied him for a brief second, as if measuring not the words, but the intent behind them. Then she nodded once, a small acknowledgement that did not expand the moment, but did not close it either. Ethan continued, his voice lower now, more grounded, stripped of the authority that had once defined it. I was wrong. The statement settled between them, simple, direct, but carrying a weight that could not be reduced to apology alone. Amara's expression did not shift dramatically, but something in her gaze softened, not in forgiveness, but in recognition of the truth being spoken. She adjusted the strap of her bag slightly, her posture unchanged, her presence steady. Yes, the word was quiet, not confrontational, not validating, just factual, a reflection of reality rather than a reaction to it. Ethan held her gaze, not looking away, not retreating from the moment. You saved him. Again, the words were simple, but they carried something deeper now, something that acknowledged more than the action itself. Amara's eyes shifted briefly, not downward, but toward the side, as if the statement did not belong entirely to her. I did what needed to be done. Her voice was calm, even, without emphasis, without expectation, as if the act itself required no recognition beyond its necessity. The humility in that response settled differently than anything Ethan had encountered before, not diminishing the action, but grounding it in something that did not seek validation. He nodded slowly, the motion deliberate, his understanding deepening in a way that did not resolve into a quick response. I should not have fired you. The admission came out steady, but it carried something more than correction, something closer to accountability. Amara looked at him again, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged. You did. The words were not accusatory, not emotional, just factual, anchoring the moment in reality rather than intention. Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing slightly, not in relief, but in acceptance of what could not be undone. I would like to fix that. The statement was direct, but this time, it did not carry the assumption of control, it did not assume resolution. It simply existed as an offer, open, uncertain. Amara studied him again, longer this time, her silence not empty, but full of consideration, of thought that moved beyond the surface of the words. Finally, she shook her head gently, the motion small, but final. This was never about the job. The sentence landed with a quiet clarity that shifted the entire direction of the conversation, pulling it away from transaction, away from correction, and into something deeper, something that required more than reinstatement. Ethan did not respond immediately. He let the words settle, let them reshape his understanding of what this moment required. Then what is it about? The question came out softer than anything he had said before, not because he intended it to, but because it needed to be. Amara held his gaze for a moment longer, then glanced briefly toward the clinic behind her, toward the space she had just left, before looking back at him. It is about what you see when it matters. The answer was simple, but it carried a weight that extended far beyond the moment, far beyond the conversation, reaching back to the night before, to the decision he had made, to the truth he had chosen not to see. Ethan stood there, the words settling into him slowly, not as something to respond to, but as something to understand. The distance between them had not closed, but it had changed, no longer defined by hierarchy, but by truth, by recognition, by the possibility of something that could not be forced, only earned. And for the first time, Ethan did not try to move past it. He stayed exactly where he was, allowing the moment to hold, to remain unresolved, to demand more than a single answer. The space between them did not close after her words. It expanded, not outward, but inward, stretching into something that could not be filled with a quick answer. And Ethan Caldwell stood there in the fading light, the street moving around them while the moment itself remained still, suspended in a kind of clarity he was not used to holding. Amara adjusted her bag slightly, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady but no longer fixed on him alone, as if she had already said what needed to be said, as if the rest of the understanding belonged to him now. Ethan did not move immediately. He let the silence stay, let it press against the edges of his thinking, not rushing to respond, not reaching for the kind of resolution that had always come easily to him before. For the first time, he understood that this was not a moment to control, it was a moment to learn. "You are right," he said finally, his voice lower, more measured, not as a defense, not as agreement for the sake of peace, but as acknowledgement that carried weight. "I did not see what mattered." The words landed differently than anything he had said before, not because they were complex, but because they were true in a way that could not be adjusted or reinterpreted. Amara watched him for a brief second, her expression calm, but something in her gaze shifted, not fully, not completely, but enough to register that the moment was changing, even if the outcome was not yet clear. "Most people do not," she replied quietly, her tone not critical, not dismissive, just honest, shaped by experience rather than reaction. "They see what fits, not what is real." The statement settled between them with a quiet weight, not heavy, but undeniable, and Ethan felt it land in a place that did not belong to logic, but to something deeper, something that had been untouched by the systems he had built his life around. He nodded once, slowly, the motion deliberate, as if he was placing that truth somewhere it could not be ignored again. "Then help me understand." The request came without structure, without condition, without the expectation of compliance, and that alone shifted the balance of the moment in a way that could not be undone. Amara looked at him, really looked this time, not just at the words, but at the man standing in front of her, the distance he had carried, the shift that had begun, the sincerity that had replaced certainty. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she turned slightly, glancing toward the clinic again, the door opening briefly as someone exited, the quiet rhythm of the place continuing without interruption. "There is someone inside," she said finally, her voice calm, but more grounded now, as if the next part of the conversation required context rather than explanation. Ethan followed her gaze, his attention shifting to the building, then back to her. "The patient you visit." Amara nodded once. "His name is Mr. Harlan. He does not have anyone else." The words were simple, but they carried a quiet gravity, the kind that did not need elaboration to be understood. Ethan felt something shift again, not in his posture, but in his perspective, the realization that her presence in his house had never been the full extent of her life, her impact, her purpose. "Why him?" The question came out softer, not interrogative, but genuinely seeking to understand something beyond his experience. Amara took a small breath, her gaze steady, but her tone carrying a deeper layer now. "Because someone once did the same for me." The answer was brief, but it opened something larger, something that extended beyond the moment, beyond the roles they had occupied. Ethan did not press further. He let that stand, let it hold the space it needed without trying to define it. "And you come every day?" She nodded again. "After work, before work, whenever I can." The consistency in that statement landed differently, not as obligation, but as commitment, something chosen, repeated, sustained without recognition or reward. Ethan glanced at the clinic once more, then back at her, the understanding settling deeper with each passing second. "I did not know." Amara's expression remained calm. "You did not ask." The truth in that response did not carry accusation, but it did not soften itself either. It simply existed, clear and grounded. Ethan accepted it without resistance, without justification. "You are right." Again, the acknowledgement came without defense, and this time, it held. The street around them continued to move, cars passing, voices blending into the background, but the moment between them had shifted into something quieter, something more deliberate. Ethan reached into his pocket, pulling out a small card, not presenting it immediately, but holding it for a second as if considering the weight of the action. "If there is anything he needs, anything at all, I can help." The offer was clear, but it was different from anything he had made before, not transactional, not strategic, but open, without condition. Amara looked at the card, then back at him, her gaze steady, her expression thoughtful. "He does not need money," she said gently, her tone not dismissive, but clarifying. He needs consistency. The words settled in a way that reshaped the offer entirely, shifting it from something external to something internal, something that could not be delegated, could not be solved with a resource. Ethan lowered his hand slightly, the card still between his fingers, his understanding adjusting once more. Then I will come with you. The statement came out before he could refine it, before he could structure it into something more measured, but once spoken, it remained, grounded in a sincerity that did not retreat. Amara held his gaze, her expression steady, searching for something in him that had not been there before. You do not know what that means. Her voice was quiet, not challenging, but clear. Ethan nodded once. Then show me. The simplicity of the response did not make it easier, but it made it real. The space between them shifted again, not closing, not resolving, but opening into something new, something that required more than intention, more than words. Amara glanced toward the clinic once more, then back at him, her decision forming not in haste, but in recognition of what stood in front of her. Finally, she turned toward the entrance, taking a step forward, then pausing just long enough to speak without looking back. If you are coming, then do not stand behind me. Walk beside me. The words carried more than direction, more than instruction. They carried a condition, a boundary, a redefinition of how this moment would move forward. Ethan did not hesitate. He stepped forward, closing the distance, aligning his pace with hers, not ahead, not behind, but beside. And as they moved toward the door together, the shift was no longer internal. It was visible, undeniable, and for the first time, it was shared. The clinic door opened with a soft chime that barely carried beyond the frame, and as Ethan Caldwell stepped inside beside Amara, the shift was immediate, not dramatic, but unmistakable, like stepping into a space where everything that mattered moved at a different pace, measured not in urgency, but in presence. The air felt warmer, quieter, the low hum of activity surrounding them without demanding attention, and for a moment, Ethan did not move forward. He simply stood there, aware of the difference, aware that this place did not adjust to him, did not recognize his position, his name, his influence. It did not need to. Amara did not pause. She moved with quiet familiarity, her steps steady, her presence blending into the rhythm of the clinic in a way that suggested belonging without ownership. Ethan followed, not leading, not directing, but matching her pace, the subtle adjustment in his stride deliberate, intentional. They passed the reception desk, the same woman from earlier offering a small nod to Amara, her expression softening in recognition, a silent acknowledgement that required no words. Ethan noticed it, the ease of that exchange, the absence of hierarchy, the simple clarity of connection. Down the hallway, the light shifted slightly, softer, filtered through frosted windows that lined the walls, each door marked with quiet precision, each room holding something unseen but deeply felt. Amara stopped at one of the doors, her hand resting lightly against the handle, her posture steady, her gaze forward. Ethan stood just beside her, not ahead, not behind, exactly where she had asked him to be. She glanced at him once, briefly, not questioning, not confirming, just acknowledging his presence before she opened the door. The room inside was small, but it carried a stillness that felt complete rather than empty. A single bed stood near the window, sunlight touching the edge of the blanket, casting a soft glow across the space. An older man lay there, his frame thin, his face lined with time, but his eyes open, alert in a quiet, observant way that suggested he had learned to measure the world differently. He turned his head slightly as they entered, his gaze landing first on Amara, and in that instant, something shifted in the room, something that did not need explanation. There you are, he said softly, his voice carrying a warmth that filled the space more than volume ever could. Amara stepped forward, her expression softening in a way Ethan had not seen before, not dramatic, not exaggerated, but real, grounded, present. I told you I would come back. The words were simple, but they carried a promise that had already been kept many times before. Ethan remained near the doorway, not intruding, not stepping forward until Amara moved slightly to the side, creating space for him without announcing it. This is Ethan, she said calmly, her tone neutral, not elevating, not diminishing, simply stating. He wanted to meet you. The older man studied Ethan for a brief moment, his gaze steady, not intimidated, not impressed, just aware. Then he nodded once, a small gesture that held quiet acceptance. "You are welcome here." The words were offered without hesitation, without condition, and Ethan felt them land in a way that no formal introduction ever had. He stepped closer, his posture composed, but different, less rigid, less defined by expectation. "Thank you." His voice was lower than usual, not because he intended it, but because the space required it. He glanced around the room briefly, noticing the details, the small table with a few personal items, a book resting near the edge, a glass of water placed within easy reach, everything arranged with care rather than perfection. Amara moved naturally within the space, adjusting the blanket slightly, checking the water, her movements quiet, practiced, not as tasks, but as gestures of presence. Ethan watched her, not with curiosity alone, but with a growing understanding of something he had never taken the time to see. "You came early today," the man said, his eyes following her movements with quiet appreciation. Amara nodded. "I had time." The simplicity of the answer did not reveal the effort behind it, but it did not need to. Ethan stepped slightly closer, his gaze shifting between them, the dynamic clear without explanation, the connection grounded in something deeper than obligation. Mr. Harlan turned his attention back to Ethan, his expression thoughtful, his voice calm. "She does that, you know. Shows up when it matters." The statement was not directed as a lesson, but it carried one nonetheless, and Ethan felt it settle with a weight that echoed the words Amara had spoken earlier. He nodded slowly, not offering a response that would diminish the truth of it. "I am beginning to understand that." Mr. Harlan smiled faintly, the expression small but genuine, as if the acknowledgement itself was enough. Amara finished adjusting the blanket, then pulled the chair closer to the bed, sitting down with the same quiet ease she had carried into the room. She reached for the book on the table, opening it without looking at the cover, her familiarity with it clear. "Do you want me to continue where we left off?" Mr. Harlan nodded, settling back slightly, his eyes softening as he prepared to listen. Ethan remained standing for a moment longer, then moved to the other side of the room, finding a place that did not interrupt, did not draw attention, simply allowed him to be present. Amara began to read, her voice steady, warm, carrying a rhythm that filled the space without overwhelming it. The words themselves were simple, but the way she spoke them, the way she held the pauses, the way she let the silence between sentences breathe, created something more than a story. It created presence. Ethan listened, not analyzing, not interpreting, just allowing the moment to exist without needing to shape it. Time moved quietly in that room, not marked by minutes, but by connection, by consistency, by the simple act of showing up and staying. When she finished the page, Amara closed the book gently, placing it back on the table with care. Mr. Harlan exhaled softly, his expression calm, settled in a way that spoke to something deeper than comfort. "You always know when to stop." Amara smiled faintly, not in pride, but in understanding. "That is because I listen." The words echoed softly, not just in the room, but in Ethan's mind, connecting back to everything that had led him here. Listening, not reacting, not assuming, just being present enough to see what mattered. He stood there, the realization settling deeper, not as something he could fix immediately, but as something he would have to learn, step by step, moment by moment. And as the light shifted slightly across the room, the quiet holding steady, Ethan did not reach for control, did not move to change anything. He stayed exactly where he was, allowing the moment to shape him instead. The room remained still long after the final word had faded, the kind of stillness that did not feel empty, but full, carrying the weight of presence rather than silence. And Ethan Caldwell stood where he was, no longer measuring time, no longer waiting for a moment to end so the next could begin, simply existing within it in a way that felt unfamiliar, but necessary. Amara adjusted the edge of the blanket once more, a small, almost unnoticeable movement, then leaned back slightly in the chair, her posture relaxed, her gaze steady on Mr. Harlan as if nothing else in the world required her attention in that moment. The older man's breathing had slowed, his eyes half closed, not asleep, but settled, grounded, in a way that suggested peace rather than rest. Ethan watched them both, The simplicity of the scene holding something that no boardroom, no contract, no measured decision had ever carried for him before. It was not about outcome. It was about consistency. It was about showing up without needing to be seen doing it. He exhaled slowly, the realization settling deeper with each passing second, not as a sudden shift, but as a steady understanding that reshaped the way he saw everything that had led him here. After a few minutes, Amara stood, her movement quiet, careful not to disturb the calm that had settled over the room. She glanced at Ethan briefly, not signaling, not asking, just acknowledging, then turned toward the door. Ethan followed, stepping out into the hallway beside her, the soft light meeting them again, the hum of the clinic returning in gentle waves. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was different now, not weighted with tension, but with something quieter, something more reflective. Finally, Ethan broke it, his voice low, steady, but carrying something deeper than before. I understand now why you said it was not about the job. Amara continued walking, her pace unhurried, her expression calm. It never was. The answer came easily, not as a correction, but as a truth that had always been there. Ethan nodded once, his gaze drifting briefly toward the doors lining the hallway, each one holding a story he had never taken the time to see. I cannot change what I did. The admission came without hesitation, without defense, the weight of it accepted fully. Amara stopped near the exit, turning slightly toward him, her eyes steady, her posture grounded. No, you cannot. The clarity in her voice did not soften the reality, but it did not harden it either. It simply held it as it was. Ethan held her gaze, the space between them no longer defined by hierarchy, but by truth. But I can decide what I do next. The words were not a promise. Not yet. But they carried intention, the beginning of something that required action rather than explanation. Amara studied him for a moment, the shift in him visible, not in his posture, but in the way. He stood without needing to control the outcome. That is the only part that matters. She opened the door, stepping out into the evening air, the light now softer, the sky beginning to shift into deeper tones as the day moved toward its end. Ethan followed, the sound of the door closing behind them marking the transition, not just in space, but in understanding. They stood on the sidewalk again, the same street, the same movement around them, but nothing felt the same. For a brief second, neither of them moved. Then Amara turned slightly, adjusting her bag, her gaze lifting toward the direction she had been heading earlier. I have to go. The words were simple, not dismissive, not final, just a statement of continuation, of a life that did not pause for resolution. Ethan nodded once, accepting it without trying to extend the moment beyond what it was. Of course. He hesitated for just a fraction of a second, then added, I will be here tomorrow. The statement was quiet, not imposed, not expected, just offered, grounded in intention rather than certainty. Amara looked at him, her expression steady, her gaze searching not for the words, but for the truth behind them. Then she nodded once, a small acknowledgement that did not confirm anything, but did not dismiss it either. We will see. The answer was open, not closed, leaving space for action to define what words could not. She turned then, walking down the sidewalk with the same steady pace, her figure moving into the rhythm of the street without drawing attention, without needing to. Ethan watched her go, not from a distance of control, but from a place of recognition, understanding now that presence was not something he could demand, it was something he would have to earn. He stood there until she disappeared into the flow of people, the space she left behind not empty, but marked, defined by the shift that had taken place. After a moment, he turned back toward his car, his steps measured, but no longer automatic. As he reached for the door, his phone vibrated in his pocket, the sound sharp against the quiet of his thoughts. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen, his assistant's name appearing, the familiar rhythm of his other world calling him back. He answered without hesitation, his voice steady, but different now, carrying something that had not been there before. Yes. There was a brief pause on the other end. Then her voice came through, precise, efficient. Sir, the board is asking if you will still be attending the meeting tomorrow morning. Ethan looked up, his gaze drifting across the street, the clinic behind him, the memory of the room, the quiet, the presence, all still clear in his mind. For a moment, he did not respond. Then he exhaled slowly, the decision forming not from habit, but from understanding. Reschedule it. The words were simple, but they carried a shift that extended far beyond a single meeting. There was a brief pause on the other end, then a quick acknowledgement. Of course, sir. The call ended, and Ethan lowered the phone, slipping it back into his pocket as he opened the car door and stepped inside. The engine started with the same quiet power it always had, but the direction he chose now was no longer defined by obligation, by expectation, by the systems he had built. It was defined by something else entirely. As he pulled away from the curb, the city lights beginning to flicker on in the distance, he did not look back at the skyline, did not orient himself toward the center of his influence. Instead, he drove forward, carrying with him a truth that could not be undone, but could be lived differently, moment by moment, step by step, in ways that would not announce themselves, but would matter exactly where they needed to.